Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm excited about the presentation we have scheduled for you that First Trust will put on. I will introduce Trevor for you all, and then he will introduce our speaker, Andrew. But before we kick it off, I wanted to let everyone know about some of the upcoming events we have planned. On Thursday, May 20th, we have a webinar, Digitizing Your Practice for the Future of Financial Advice. This is with Scion Investments. It's really more for practice development. If any of you are looking to enhance your digital marketing strategy, this would be a fantastic presentation to attend. And for those offices that may actually have intern help this summer and maybe thinking of things that they're looking for him or her to do, this might be a great webinar for you. It might give them a great path to really figure out what your digital marketing strategy might be for the summer months coming up ahead. The next event we have is on Friday, June 25th. That's our annual meeting at the Detroit Tigers game. And we actually do have tickets in hand for that event. So I know when we initially planned that, we were uncertain as to what the summer might look like from a baseball perspective, but we do have tickets for that. So that will be a great event. And then the last event we have planned for the summer is on July 20th. It's a summer golf outing at Oakland University. And so you will be receiving emails in the coming months with more information about all of those items. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to let anyone from the board or Michelle know. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce Trevor. Trevor is an internal wholesaler covering Southeast Michigan and Northern Indiana. In his role, he works closely with each financial professional to provide them with industry-leading economic and market commentary, portfolio analysis for investment solutions, and practice management consulting. Trevor's specific focus is First Trust's suite of ETFs. Trevor earned his bachelor's degree from Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan, not far from here. And Trevor is also a CFA charter holder and an active member in our local society. He also holds his Series 7 and 66 licenses as well. So with that, I'll go ahead and kick it over to Trevor, and then I'll facilitate the Q&A later in the presentation.
Great. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, everyone tuning in today. We appreciate it. As she mentioned, my name is Trevor Bushhouse, cover ETFs with First Trust. My partner is Zach Ulrich, who many of you I know already know. He lives locally outside Detroit in Bloomfield Hills. And then as Ashley just mentioned as well, I'm probably one of the most recent members to join the CFA Society of Detroit. So fortunate enough to pass level 3, so couldn't be happier to be done studying. Today we're really excited to bring you some economic perspective rooted in data. It was exactly a year and a day ago that you all heard from Andrew Opdyke here, and as we all know, a lot has changed since then. Right now, I'm actually sitting in my hotel room, the Townsend Hotel in Birmingham. First time I have been able to travel out to Michigan in over a year. So to say I'm excited is an understatement. And I'll also be at the Top Golf event tomorrow. So excited to meet anybody who will be joining that as well. So now let me introduce our guest speaker today, Andrew Opdyke, senior economist here with First Trust. He went to Hope College on the west side of the state. He also earned his MBA from Northwestern University, and he's also a fellow charter holder. So he's part of our economics team here, working alongside Brian Westbury, digging into the data and bringing the economic perspective for financial professionals. And part of that team, they consistently rank #1 in terms of most shared, most read, as well as one of the most accurate forecasters on the street. So with that said, Andrew, I will turn the call over to you. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Trevor. Thank you, Ashley. Trevor, congrats on passing the 3rd level, being done with the test. Great feeling. It's great to be back with everyone. As he said, a year and a day, and a lot has changed. Now, we see this in the economic data. I'll say, too, that starting towards the end of last year, I started to get back towards traveling. Right now, I'm on the road 2-3 days during the week. I just got back last night from North Dakota, of all places. And what I'll note as we start to look at the data is we can see the numbers. We can see the numbers, we can see how it shows up in economic indicators, but traveling across the country, I'm seeing this in person. Over the last 6 weeks, I've been in Portland, Oregon, I've been in Vancouver, Washington, which is kind of one side of the spectrum in terms of things being shut down and a bit of a slower pace of getting back to normal. I spent time on the East Coast in Charlotte, North Carolina. I went down south to Houston, Texas. I've spent time in the last few weeks in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and now North Dakota. And I will say that everywhere I go, activity is picking back up. And this is, I think, a wonderful thing that we're seeing as we move back towards normal, as the vaccines get out and are distributed, and they've kind of gotten broad distribution in the population. But I want to remind everybody that there were some significant questions coming into the first quarter of this year on what that first quarter was going to look like. We were starting the distribution of vaccines. It started mid-December. December 14th is when we kind of started shots in arms on a broader scale. But when we moved into the first 2 weeks of this year, case numbers were hitting highs. And we had increased restrictions, not to the level that we saw in that March-April time period, not full shutdown, shelter in place, because of what we learned over the summer in terms of identification, in terms of figuring out what we could and couldn't do within this environment. But as we got to the beginning of this year, the case numbers were hitting all-time highs. And I remember at the end of last year reading a lot of the research, and a lot of the major groups were predicting that first quarter GDP could be zero. There were some discussions on whether the first quarter economic number could be a negative print, and then we would start to see a pickup in the second, the third quarter of this year. Instead, what we saw is the number started to decline at a pretty rapid pace, starting in late January, going into February. The numbers now, and we did see a little pickup. I think you guys really saw this in Michigan, a short burst, a wave kind of over recent months. But in general, case numbers right now are roughly down 80% from where we were. And we see this too in hospitalization data. Hospitalization data is down about 80%. Now, the first groups that we targeted were the most vulnerable groups. And so with that, we've seen a larger decline on the mortality side and some of the severe cases. But let's take a second and stop now and think about how far we've come on vaccinations. Again, going back to January, February this year, we were watching TV and we were listening to discussions or watching, there were some reports being put out, for example, on Bloomberg on a daily basis. And they said, if we continue at this current pace, we could be reaching herd immunity, 70, 80, 90% by June, July of next year. Because at this point in time, we were doing a few 100,000 vaccine shots per day. Well, we all know that number has significantly accelerated. As it stands right now in the 18-plus adult population, we have more than half with at least one dose. And this is important because starting roughly 2 weeks after the first dosage, you already start to see antibody responses in the system. It's reduced in all the trials after the first dose. It's reducing the likelihood of, even if you catch COVID, severe outcomes. But the first dose is the first step towards the second dose, towards the vaccination. As it stands, and this is the data through Monday of this week, so this number is actually now 56.4. The fully vaccinated is just over 40.3. This number, as we move here into the next few weeks, is going to reach more than half of the adult population in the United States fully vaccinated. And this is kind of an amazing thing. I got the shot as soon as it opened up here in the Chicagoland area, as soon as it was available to 18 and older. And when I went to go do that, it was difficult to find a location where I could get the shot. I would log on to the system, and everywhere that I would go say, we are sold out, we're fully booked out over the next 5 days. That's how much we are willing to book. Finally, I got it through my healthcare provider. Well, this past weekend, I went to Walgreens just for a general pickup, going to get groceries. And they were telling everybody who came through the register, they were asking, have you gotten your shot yet? If not, we have extra doses. We now have more doses than we have people who we can fill it with. So anybody, if you know somebody who wants the vaccine, tell them, come here. They don't need an appointment, and they can come and they can get that vaccination. We've seen a significant movement. Now they're starting from an administrative level to shift where some of the shots are being sent to in order to kind of fill out places that are still seeing high demand. But if you want the shot today, you can get it pretty much anywhere here in the United States. That's the adult population, but I want to target in a little bit on the 65 and older demographic, because we learned very early on that this was the group that was the most at risk. This was the group that was likely to have the most severe health outcomes. It's roughly 30% of the U.S. population, but it represented 93 93% of mortalities from COVID. So we started with this group first, and here's where those numbers stand. We have more than 4 out of every 5 has received at least 1 dose, and they are just about to reach 70% full vaccination. We will not get to 100% on any of these groups. There are some people who they've been advised not to get it for health reasons. But these numbers, we were watching, and the key question was, what is the impact that this, particularly this group, what's the impact that this is going to have in terms of bringing case numbers down in our most vulnerable population? And here's what the numbers look like through that period when vaccines started. This is the week of December 13th. This is the week of December 20th. So right in here, December 14th is when we started the vaccinations. Well, we have numbers now through the end of April, and cases are down 97%. And mortalities are down a similar amount. I mean, this to me is an incredible thing. This is phenomenal news that those groups that we wanted to protect the most, that we needed to protect the most, now are in a significantly better spot than they have been essentially at any time since all of this started. With the case numbers declining, with the vaccinations, and now we are doing over 100 million vaccinations per month, that vaccine progress, the state reopening, and oh yeah, we got checks that got passed in December, and we saw spending in January. We got checks in March that were passed in March that saw $200 billion of additional funds put into consumer accounts. Well, here's a look at retail spending, retail sales, and it's clear the acceleration that we've seen at the start of this year as the environment has improved. This morning, we got data on the service side of the economy from the ISM, the Institute of Supply Chain Management, and I think one of their people said it quite well. Demand is there. Our ability to fill that demand is still at times hampered because of restrictions, because of issues on the supply chain side, but demand is there. People want to get back out. If I look at the numbers, the year-over-year comparisons get a little bit tricky here because we're comparing March of 2021 with March of last year where the numbers were already starting to decline. If we use those numbers, we're up a little bit over 25% in the past year in terms of consumer purchases. I want to say let's take a step back a month. Let's take a look at where we were in February. And February is when we saw the winter storms that moved across the United States, the polar vortex that hit Texas and had issues with their power systems, burst pipes, it shut down a lot of activity. With that, we saw a decline in consumer purchases through the month of February. But I like to look at February because it's the last month we had where we could compare year over year to a pre-COVID period. And what you see is that even with the decline in February here in the United States, when we look at where we were in March of 2020, we were still up about 6.3% year over year. Compare that to a period like the financial crisis, where activity declined and it started to make that comeback, but it was a 2-year period for activity to get back towards normal. When we spoke a year ago, one of the things we were talking about is this wasn't a normal recession. The doors weren't shut across this country, East Coast, West Coast, North, South, because of bad products, because of bad service. It wasn't because these companies were in poor financial shape, right? This was a virus that came in from the outside, and we had these kind of governmental responses to shut things down. Now, the economy is not like a light switch. It's not something that you can just turn off and turn back on. It has consequences when you turn it off. We saw that massive decline, and coming back, we've seen a pickup in activity, but it hasn't been the same across industries or sectors, right? If we think about our downtowns, when I look at downtown Wheaton, which is where I'm based today, this is 26 miles straight west of downtown Chicago, but I'll tell you, I'm seeing this in cities, both major urban areas and in the suburbs across the country. Activity doesn't look like it's back and above where we were pre-COVID, and that's because in many of these areas, it's not. We are dominated in our downtowns by restaurants and bars, leisure and hospitality, small and medium-sized businesses. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York put out a paper this morning. They put out a release where they have been tracking small and medium-sized business activity. And what they look at is some of these payroll systems, these activity systems, that these groups use. And they have about 100,000 people, hundreds of thousand businesses that use this. What they found is that as it stands right now, they have about 35% fewer small and medium-sized businesses using reporting activity. Is it a perfect measure? No, but it gives us an idea of the magnitude of companies that were open back then and are not open now. And a lot of that came because there was a significant period of time in there where their doors shut and they weren't sure if they were going to be able to reopen. They started some reopening processes in some areas of the country, and they were open at 25% capacity. But even at 25% capacity, it was not going to be a sustainable level to keep the lights on. Now, I think you guys in the Michigan area, I think it's a similar kind of lower level of capacity that's in place right now. About 5 weeks ago, I was on the West Coast. I was in Portland, Oregon. I was in Vancouver, Washington. And what I saw there was 25% capacity as we had an event at a restaurant. It looked like the restaurant was largely closed because so many of the tables were standing completely empty. But when we went to the front, there was an hour and a half wait to get in the door. And the next week, when I was on the East Coast, when I'm in Charlotte, they have higher levels of capacity. They were at 60 to 70%. But again, I'm seeing lines at the doors, and people are waiting 20 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour to get in so that they can get out. And so when I see these numbers for things on restaurants and bars, what I see here is that this number is not back to normal, not because of a lack of demand, but because we haven't had that capacity to supply it. Now, some areas of the economy have kind of gotten back to normal. We've got the general merchandise stores, your Costco's, your Walmarts of the world. This bump that we saw early last year, that was the great toilet paper run of 2020. My parents are still working through their stock. There was a little shutdown period, but overall, well, more volatile. This is kind of back in line. So where has this consumption come from? How is it that retail sales are up above pre-COVID levels? And it's because we moved from the outside inside and the inside online. We saw this trend in activity that was taking place pre-COVID get accelerated. Now, I can't see everyone's hands, but I want you to think about something for a minute. How many of you did a Zoom call last year? If I asked you to raise your hands, I can't see you, but I'm guessing basically every hand would be raised on who did a Zoom call in 2020. But if I ask how many people did a Zoom call in 2019, when I talk with people, that number is typically significantly lower. And when I look at the data, I look, for example, at Zoom's daily active users, it grew tenfold from December of 2019 until that midpoint in 2020. We saw this mass adoption of systems because we had to figure out how were we going to work in this environment. Now, we're incredibly blessed. It's very short of miraculous that we live in this time where we have these computers in our pockets. We've got cell phones, we've got smartphones, we have cloud, we have cybersecurity, things that allowed us to make a relatively seamless transition from working in offices to working from home. It allowed us to continue communications. It allowed us to continue to meet remotely. My wife is a teacher. This was the life of her students for the first half of this year. If COVID had happened 30 years ago, this economic recovery would have looked very different. I think it would have been substantially slower. But we as individuals, companies outside adapted to this environment and said, we have constraints upon us, but we are going to work within these constraints. Now, I have to look and think about where are we going from here as we look through the remainder of 2021 and we look out into 2022, what are going to be the drivers? Last year, it was narrower leadership. These restaurants and bars, the downtowns were declining. Well, the market, typically market-based companies, were expanding. We saw IT, we saw communication services, we saw healthcare really taking off when so many other areas were slow. This year, I think we're going to see a broadening out. We're seeing this on the market-based side. We're seeing it in the economic data as well. You can see this acceleration that we're seeing in restaurants and bars. And we've heard from the airlines, they are recalling all the pilots that were furloughed. They're trying to hire additional pilots. I will tell you, going through O'Hare, and again, I'm usually on 3 to 4 flights a week, and the airports are filling back up, and the number of flights that are available is starting to get back towards normal. As I look out through the remainder of this year, I think this is the area that's going to be kind of leaders in some of this economic activity, because everywhere I go, when I talk with people, people have these bucket lists. These things they wanted to do last year but couldn't. The family trip they didn't take. The relatives that they want to go see. The weddings that were delayed that they're planning on going to now this year. My parents, I think, are a great example of this. My parents were terrified by COVID. They're older. They have pre-existing conditions. They live 25 minutes from me, and I've got 2 kids. These are the grandkids, which it's nearly impossible to keep them away from the grandkids in normal times. But when COVID hit, they were nervous, and so we transitioned from seeing each other in person to doing FaceTimes on the phones, to doing WebExes or Zooms so they could still see the kids. They could read books, they could play games, but we were doing that separated. My parents, because of those conditions, had early access. They got their shots early on in the process. Now, what's the first thing my parents did when they got their second shots? They booked a cruise because they love to travel. They go on trips nearly every year. They didn't last year. And so as soon as they felt comfortable and said, look, in 2 weeks, we'll have these antibodies built up. In 2 weeks, we'll be able to travel. Well, we'll start looking out at 2022. So they called the cruise lines, and the cruise line said, yes, we can get you on a cruise in March of next year, but the rooms are limited. And it wasn't that the rooms were limited because of constraints on how many they were going to allow aboard. They said, we are seeing activity now like we haven't seen. The activity levels in our bookings now are above anything we saw in 2019. People want to get back to normal, and I think we're going to continue to see a tailwind impact on the economic data as we move further in this year. Some of the months may slow from what we saw in January and March because we had the addition of the stimulus checks that hit bank accounts. People on average spent a third, used a third to pay down debt, and then saved a third. Some of that money they saved, I think, is going to come back into the system, and I think we're going to see a bit of a rotation, as we already are, towards these types of companies, and we're going to see our main streets coming back. With that, it's going to be one of the key drivers on the employment side. We will get the employment numbers for the month of April at the end of this week. Our forecast as of today is to see non-farm payrolls grow by about 990,000. Similar to March, we're nearing 1 million prints per month as things reopen, as businesses are trying to bring people back. They could be bringing people back further. They could be bringing people back faster if they could fill positions. We have places like the Kansas City Fed reporting that their local businesses are saying, we are having a hard time filling jobs. There's the additional unemployment benefits that remain out there. There are people who are still concerned, still nervous about COVID. Our companies are trying to hire, but cannot find people. They will take almost anybody. The only people they were refusing are people who can't pass a drug test that we tell them is coming. And even then, we'll still think about it. So the numbers here are going to be strong. They're held back a little bit because of the ability to lure people back into the labor force. But our best guess is that this year we're going to see employment gains for the year of 6 to 7 million. Now, we've brought back 1.6 million roughly through the first 3 months of the year. If I step back to where we were at December, of the 22.4 million jobs that we lost, which, for reference, essentially offset the 10 years of job gains from the bottom of the financial crisis until February of 2020, right before COVID started. In 2 months, we essentially X'd out 10 years of gains. That's what happened when we turned the lights off. Now, so far through December, we had brought back 12.3 million jobs. So let me take that 6 million, I'll plug that in here. That would put us at 18.3 million jobs. And let me note that 6 million jobs in 2021, that would be the single best year of employment growth that the U.S. economy has ever seen. But at 18.3 million, it's not too difficult math to see we would still be down. And I will say this is the key number that the Federal Reserve is looking at. You hear Chair Powell talking, and the questions have come up. They came up at the recent press conference. We see some of the data exploding. We see these employment numbers are starting to accelerate. We see retail sales is strong, durable goods orders are strong, companies are investing. And they asked the Fed, what if this stuff starts to pick up? Are you going to start talking about tapering? Are you going to start talking about moving earlier? And they said, employment is not back. Employment is not back, and this is one of those things that we're certainly going to be watching. because these are concentrated in lower income positions. And the Fed has been explicit in saying that is a group that they are looking to target and make sure that this group is getting back towards where we were. And remember, this is 4.1 million down from where we were at the end of February 2020. This number would have continued to move higher. So this is getting us back towards where we were, but it takes us below what trend would have been. So they said this number is our key number, and it's going to take beyond this year. It's likely going to take beyond 2022, and that's why they said we are not moving. We're going to keep interest rates incredibly accommodative. Now, there may be more spending coming, which could also lead to a pickup on the job side. There's things like the infrastructure bill. Now, the infrastructure bill has some disagreements between the Democratic side, $2.3 trillion, the Republicans who've said, no, we're looking for something in the range of $600 billion. But there are a few areas that are agreed on: roads and bridges, broadband, public transit and rail, airports and seaports, and water. These are agreed upon items, and I think we could very well see an infrastructure bill done before the end of this year. This spending, this money coming into the system is more likely to hit more into 2022. So this is going to continue to be a tailwind factor into both the employment numbers as well as the economic data numbers as we move into next year. But one of the things that all of this spending is starting to bring about is the questions related to inflation. So let me take a moment and talk about the inflation picture. In the short term, inflation numbers are picking up. We had gotten the data last month. The CPI numbers, the PPI numbers reached over 2.5% on a year-over-year basis, because the next 2 months are going to be comparing to, again, down months from last year. Even modest numbers on the inflation front are going to push us into 3-4%. This is clearly above the Fed's 2% inflation target, but Chair Powell says this is transitory. Right? The inflation pressures that we're seeing, and this morning's ISM services report saw the prices paid index hitting the highest level that we've seen in a decade. There were 32 commodities reported up in price, and there was roughly 2 to 3 that were down. We see a number reported in short supply. This, I agree, is going to be transitory. That these price pressures, whether it's semiconductors, whether it's wood, whether it's steel and aluminum, the constraints that are having the largest impact on the inflation numbers here in the next, say, 6 to 12 months, those are likely to ease. They're likely to be transitory factors as jobs come back, as supply chains get back towards normal, as international recovers and is able to fill some of that demand. But I don't think that's the full inflation picture, because at the same time, we've had this massive explosion in M2. Okay, M2, take a step back to macroeconomics class, money and banking. The M2 is currency. It's checking accounts, it's savings accounts, it's money market funds. And we have seen an explosion. Right now, it's up 24% year over year. We have not seen money supply growth of this magnitude since 1942, 1943. And that was when we were financing World War II. Now, this money that's come into the system, again, some of it's been spent, some of it's going towards debt down payments, some of it is sitting in savings. Roughly a third is sitting in savings. I want to note this is fundamentally different from QE. QE was the Fed buying treasuries from banks and agency mortgage-backed securities, and they gave banks reserves. They credited them in the system, but the banks didn't lend. So it was non-inflationary. It was not really that stimulative to the U.S. economy. This money through PPP, this money through additional unemployment benefits, this money through the stimulus checks that went out is in the hands of consumers and businesses. Again, the New York Fed estimates that cash and cash-like assets on household balance sheets rose by about $2 trillion last year. Now, I look at this spending, and I look at what took place from a stimulus standpoint, and it's kind of like opioids, right? It's kind of like morphine, where the economy crashed. And the Fed came in and the government came in and said, we need to find a way to ease through this process. It's kind of like if you were to get into a car accident and you break your arm. Okay, they can put you on morphine. They can do things that ease the pain, but it's a temporary thing. If you don't reset that bone, then when the morphine wears off, you're still going to feel that pain. It doesn't fix the issue. It covers it up temporarily. And the risk you have is things like addiction. There's a risk we become addicted to the spending because it was easy. It got us through this process. It helped fill paychecks when people couldn't work, when they were out of work. But it didn't fix some of the issues. Again, that New York Fed report from this morning saying that 35% of the small and medium-sized businesses they're tracking are no longer operating. There was a prior report that said last year we lost somewhere in the neighborhood of 800,000 businesses nationally. And so we can accelerate activity. We can accelerate spending here in the short to medium term, but unless we fix the underlying issues, it means we're still going to face some pains as we get back towards sustainable growth. And this is one of the things, the spending is going to continue through 2021, whether it's the infrastructure or the additional bill that was discussed or proposed a week or two ago for things like universal pre-K, community college. That spending may come through and it may continue to help boost economic activity. But it's to a degree, it's like if we all went out and maxed out our credit cards. If you go out today and max out your credit cards, and I'm not telling you to do this, please don't go out and do this. But if you did, we could raise GDP. We could lift consumption. But are any of us richer for doing so? And I think we all know the answer to that is no. We would not be richer for going out and maxing out credit cards. We would now have a bill that's going to be coming due, and it would be a deterrent. It would take away from future consumption. And that's one of the risks. Now, this money that's sitting in the system and additional money potentially coming through, I do believe this is going to be inflationary. As we get past the next 6 to 12 months, as confidence comes back, this money does not need to be lent by banks. They do not need to give consumers money. They already have it. The checking and savings accounts numbers are up substantially, up trillions of dollars in the last year. And as confidence comes back, if they decide that they want to spend, they want to purchase, there is virtually nothing the Federal Reserve can do in order to stop that. And so with these factors, I think we are going to see inflation running in the 3 to 4% range this year, next year, and into 2023. Now, the government says, okay, we are spending a lot of money today, but we're going to find ways to pay for this. And that's brought up in recent weeks, the tax question. And here's what I'll say on tax. Tax changes are coming. I do think that we are going to see the corporate tax rate moved up to 25 to 28%. Right now, I believe it's going to end up being 28%. I think we're going to see the top personal tax rate moved back to 39.6. Now, remember, we were at 39.6 under all 8 years of Clinton. Under the last 4 years of Obama, we didn't see a recession in any of those years. This corporate tax rate, we were at 34, 35% from 1987 until 2017. Then we dropped it to 21. This is not even bringing us back to where we were for a generation. Okay, these can be a headwind to economic activity. They can be a market headwind, but we can continue to grow through this. But that's not it. There's a couple more tax changes. The tax rates on dividends and cap gains. Now, the cap gains number that's been discussed over recent weeks was, let's move it to the top personal tax rate for high income earners. You've heard numbers, I'm sure, of around 43%. I do not think we're going to see that. I don't think that Manchin's on board with it. I don't think that Sinema or Kelly out of Arizona are on board. And when you have a 50-50 split in the Senate, you cannot lose one vote, much less 3. I think this number could move higher, but I don't think it's going to reach the levels that have been semi-proposed. I think we're more likely to see a number come out around 24%. You add in that 3.8% Medicare Medicaid tax, that gets you to roughly 28%, which is exactly where things ended under Reagan. And I think that's how they'll position it. Okay, but there's more. We could see not a tax hike, but a tax cut, the SALT deductions. This may get rolled in on this piece, or it may get rolled in on this piece. That doesn't impact everyone equally. It's disproportionately impactful for New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, California, Oregon, Washington. But this tax change may come through. The last one I want to talk about is the question on the step-up basis on inherited assets. This was in the news over the last week. The new proposal is when assets are inherited, there's a $1 million exemption per person and a $250,000 exemption for housing, but they want to tax at the time of inheritance on the gains from inherited assets. Now, this is a change from how this has historically been done, but it's incredibly difficult to implement. Trying to find the original value on some of these assets that have been held for decades is an accounting nightmare. And in part because of that, I don't think we're going to see the step-up basis on assets put into place. But I do think that we could see a movement on the estate tax exemption. Right now, we're at about 11.5 million. I think we may see this number move to the 5 to 7 million range. So these are, with the exemption of SALT, these are tax hikes that are likely to come in 2022. And these are potentially a headwind from the earnings standpoint, from an economic standpoint. But when I look at what we see on the tailwind side, what I see from the economic recovery, what I see happening from a growth standpoint, the growth that we're seeing this year, first quarter up at a 6.4% annualized rate. The second quarter looks like it's growing even faster. What held back Q1 growth was a decline in inventories. And those inventories, I think we're going to see the building on those in the second quarter. It's going to move from being a headwind to a tailwind. Second quarter GDP could very easily be in double digits. This month, we are likely to get back to where we were from a national output level, which, take a moment to appreciate that. We could be getting back to where we were in terms of 2019 output, and we're still down 8 million jobs. We've seen a boost in productivity. And that boost in productivity from the adoption of technology, from these movements that we've seen over the past year, may continue to be a tailwind into 2022 and beyond. The pace may slow in the second half of this year as we pluck some of that low-hanging fruit, and we're likely to still be below the trend that we were on, because we're still going to have jobs that haven't returned. We still have businesses that haven't come back. When we turn the light switch off and turned it back on, it's kind of like it's like the gymnasiums back in junior high, where they would turn the lights off and turn them back on, but it took a half hour, and the lights would flicker until the power came back on, the lights reset. The U.S. economy is in that reset period. We lost. There was damage done. It does not come back immediately. We have to get this process back up and rolling, but we're on that process right now. Now, I want to end by kind of switching from where we are on the GDP side, the economic side, where the tailwinds are quite strong here in the short to intermediate term, the next 2 years. We're going to see some challenges once we get beyond 2 years because of this debt bill that we've built up, because of the companies that are still not back, and the decline we're going to see on government spending. But I've gotten the question this year on, okay, well, here's where we were. We were down 2% last year, at the end of last year. How are the markets up? Market valuations. Take a moment and think about market valuations. And when we look at market valuations, there are two key inputs that we look at: interest rates and earnings. Interest rates, yes, they've gone up. And they've risen about 100 basis points from where they bottomed last year, but they remain near some of the lowest levels that we've seen in history. And we saw some significant borrowing activity done last year, debt issuance, as companies rebuilt their balance sheets or prepared for this recovery period that they saw on the horizon. This year and next year may be two of the strongest years we have seen in a very long time in terms of rebuilding balance sheets. The flows are coming in, the earnings, as we'll talk about in a minute, the cash flows are coming in, and so we could see some additional payment on debt. We could see the asset side building up and debt coverage ratios improving significantly this year. But from an equity standpoint, an equity valuation standpoint, it lowered the discount rate. And earnings, future earnings, the PE multiples should be justified higher than where they were. We could plug in the CFA formulas for justified PE ratios, and we can look at comparisons to bond yields. We can look at comparisons to Treasury yields, and I think they're likely to stay low. They're being pushed higher by inflation, but being held down by the Fed. And oh yeah, if you want to go international, you still have significant portions of debt that are earning negative interest rates. And the U.S. is seeing one of the world's strongest recoveries right now. We are further along than almost anyone else on the vaccination side. And because we have Pfizer and Moderna, we have two of the best vaccines that are available anywhere in the world. But this creates a difficult environment for you. There's no way around that. If individuals were looking and thinking about retirement in the 90s or into the 2000s, and they were pricing in a 3, 4, 5% return on treasuries, and then a little bit higher for corporates, and as you move down the line, right, interest rates are incredibly low. The returns from that are low, and credit spreads are unbelievably tight among many of the fixed income asset classes. So what we're seeing right now is people starting to kind of shift some of the flows. Maybe it's looking towards equities and it's looking towards dividends. We're seeing movements toward preferreds. With the inflation environment, we've seen movements towards commodities. People are trying to figure out, how do we hedge against the inflation? The fact that in a year or 2 or 3 years, the pressure is going to be on interest rates to move higher. And those spreads are likely to get back towards normal levels, all of which work against the fixed income assets that we're currently holding. There are more normal environments if you look at senior loans, but you're starting to get out into more equity-like asset classes. This is going to be a major conversation this year and next. But on the equity side, interest rates are going to remain accommodative. Borrowing costs, I think, are going to remain low, and this is going to be a tailwind from the equity side. On the flip side, we have the earnings picture, whereas it took 5 years for earnings to get back to where they were after the financial crisis. We saw the numbers decline last year, but I was looking at the Bloomberg numbers at the end of last week, and the forecast for this year is about 27% earnings growth, and then double-digit earnings growth in 2022. We moved activity from Main Street to Wall Street. They picked up market share. They moved and they implemented technologies that have helped in cases with margins. It's increased productivity. And now they have the cash on hand. They're investing. We're seeing that in things like durable goods orders. Businesses are investing right now. But again, like the economy, this is a broadening out. Last year, tech, communication services, healthcare. This year, we're seeing financials. We're seeing industrials, materials, the broadening out of the U.S. economy. And I think that is going to be a key discussion. That's going to be a key factor both this year and into next year. We plug these together, and we have what we call our capitalized profits model. If you want this file, let us know. Let Trevor know, let Zach know, and I will give you the Excel spreadsheet that we use to build this out. This is looking at profits, interest rates, and market movements historically over time. How have they historically moved together? Now, I'm using the numbers through Q4 2020 because it's the latest data that we have. It's the latest numbers we know for sure. And when I plug in the Q4 profits, and I use the 10-year, which then was about 86 basis points, it gives us an incredibly high valuation. So here's what we do. We say interest rates should be higher. We'll plug in 2%. Now, we're not going to take into account the 27% expected earnings growth this year or any earnings growth for 2022. We're going to say, let's stop with where things were at 2020. And that gives us a fair market valuation of 5,100. Now, you can see that these gaps can show up. The market can move away from fair valuation. Sometimes it gets ahead of itself, but it comes down to meet the math. Sometimes fear, uncertainty runs high, but ultimately it comes to meet the math. At the beginning of this year, our target was 4,200 on the S&P, but vaccinations accelerated faster than we were expecting. Jobs started to come back faster than we expected. The progress started sooner than we anticipated, and we recently moved our target to 4,500. Last year, our target was 3,650, and at the beginning of the year, I had people, when COVID was kicking in, telling me, you guys are nuts. Are you not watching what's taking place in the world around you? And at the end of the day, we always had to go back and say, look, we're going to trust the math. These gaps may open up, but we believe this math wins out over time. 3,650 ended up being a pretty strong prediction for last year. Now we're at 4,500 for this year. It's 36,750 on the Dow. Could we go higher? We could. I think there's going to be volatility as we get later in the year because of the tax question, because of any number of things that we can't foresee today. But the math as I see it suggests that the markets should continue to trend higher. Our target on the 10-year is 1.5% to 2%. Again, being pushed up by inflation, but being held down by a Fed who says we're not even talking about tapering. But this to me is the biggest number, 6% real GDP growth, a number that we haven't seen since 1984. We are seeing real activity, a real return, not just in the markets. We're seeing it now in our downtowns. We're seeing it in employment. We're seeing it in retail sales. We're seeing it in durable goods. We're seeing it on the manufacturing and the service sector side. There are a number of tailwinds right now. Now, those tax questions, those other question marks that are on the horizon, we are watching them, and where we talk about them is in our Monday Morning Outlook. It's a piece we put out every Monday. It's typically one page. Sometimes we go a little over if there's an important topic. But everything that our team puts out is retail-approved content. Our goal is to be a resource to you. That is why we exist. And we put out the Monday Morning Outlook. We are putting out recovery trackers now that are watching. Where are these metrics? Where is the airport traffic? Where are flights? Where are hotels? And we're putting this out on a weekly basis. We still have COVID trackers to see progress on those fronts. If you want anything that we put out, and again, everything from our team is retail approved. Our goal is to help you in aiding in the conversations you have with your clients. If you want anything that we publish, nothing is behind a paywall. Just let Trevor know, or let Zach know, or reach out to me, and we will get you onto those lists. But this is where we're going to be having those conversations through the remainder of this year, out into next year. It should be a strong 2021. I think we're in store for a strong 2022. There will be hiccups along the way, but the math suggests we move higher. Thank you for giving an economist 45 minutes. I love to talk about this, and I'd love to talk about it. If there's anything that I didn't cover, I think there's maybe there's a Q&A box on here. If you have any questions, I'm going to stick around. I'd love to answer any of those. But Ashley, with that, why don't I pass things back to you?
Thanks so much, Andrew. I don't see any questions in the Q&A just yet, but I do have a couple to hopefully kick things off.
Sure.
And one would really be on government spending. I know you touched on this a little bit, but what do you feel like the implications are on the national debt? And when does this become a headwind from an economic perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question, because we have spent massively last year. We passed the $1.9 trillion plan this year, and now there's 2.3 infrastructure, another roughly 1.9. The proposal is for $6 trillion in spending this year, right? We issue massive treasuries in order to do this, and as the debt rises, historically, there's been the thought, and we can go back to Rogoff on when does debt and the debt burden become a headwind to economic and market growth. So for that, I've got a couple slides, I think, right in here in case these questions, because this question comes up for me pretty frequently. The national debt number has been rising over time, right? If it was a stock chart, it would look awesome, but it's not. It's our spending. The key question from a debt perspective on when is it a headwind comes down to our interest payments as a percent of GDP. So how much are we paying out to service our debt in terms of what we produce? Think about it like an individual. How much of your income do you have to spend to pay for your mortgage, for your car payments, for your credit card payments? As your income rises, you can afford to have more debt. So this chart is looking at that from a national perspective. Interest payments as a percent of GDP. Well, debt's been rising. We've had two factors working in our favor. One is on this GDP side. GDP, our national income, has been rising over time. It means we can afford to take on more debt. Theoretically, if GDP was rising faster than debt, this would be infinitely manageable. It would be declining as a burden over time, but debt has been rising faster than GDP. So why is it that this chart has kind of moved lower over the last 40 years? Interest payments have kind of, they've benefited from the fact that interest rates have been moving lower. And so from the 80s, 90s, and the 2000s, as interest rates were moving lower, it didn't just mean that new debt we issued was being issued at lower rates, but it also meant that when debt came due, we were rolling it over at lower rates. So for example, last year when we had a 10-year treasury come due that was issued at 3% roughly back in 2010, in 2020, we were rolling that over at 0.6%, 0.7%. So it's kind of like refinancing a mortgage. Your remaining balance outstanding might not have declined, but now your monthly payments move lower because of the lower interest rate. Those factors have served to kind of move interest rates lower over the last 30 to 40 years. In fact, last year, despite the fact that GDP declined, because of the incredibly low interest rates, this interest burden last year declined as a percent of GDP. Now, I think GDP is going to continue to rise, but the interest side of things, I do expect that interest rates are going to move higher over the coming years, which means that tailwind factor, making this more manageable, all of a sudden becomes a headwind factor. It's very difficult to model out when does this get back to, for example, where we were in the 80s and 90s. And think back to the 80s and 90s, go look at the economic numbers. We saw relatively strong economic growth during this time period because while interest rates were rising, we were making changes on the regulatory front. There are some offsetting factors. The Congressional Budget Office recently did a study. They made some estimates on when we get back to these levels, and their estimate is going to be somewhere in the 2030 range. If we're growing faster and the Fed moves rates higher faster, then this number is going to move back towards this sooner. My biggest concern here is that the more money, the more GDP we need to use to pay our debts, the more it's taking out of the private sector. And I don't know about anybody who's on today, but my experience at the DMV has not gotten any better in the last 20 to 30 years. But they have no competition. When I was going to school in Chicago, when I went to Northwestern, I would take a taxi during those first few years, and the taxi experience was terrible. Then Uber comes along, and all of a sudden you have this market force. You have this incentive for these businesses to fight or die. And so that's what they did. They fought, they made the experience better, and they stole market share. I want the money in the hands of private corporations. I want that risk reward there because I think it leads to faster growth over time. If we build up this debt burden, if we don't fix this spending issue and we continue down this road, because it's so easy to do here in the short term, the risk we have is that we're taking money away from the entrepreneurs and the innovators, and we're moving it towards government. And to me, I think that's a risk. It moves us towards the French model, where they've seen 2% growth historically for decades at a time. So we'll have to watch, we'll have to wait and see. At least here in the next 1, 2, 3 years, I don't see this being a significant headwind factor.
Thank you. I also see a couple of questions coming in regards to China. And how do you feel like China impacts this outlook you've discussed?
Yeah, so China, note first of all that we haven't made any changes on the tariff front with China. China is growing. They've made some adjustments on the intellectual property, and there's been some concerns. This actually started in 2019 because of the U.S.-China trade negotiations and the tariffs going into place. At the end of 2019, we did the phase 1 trade deal, which included some implementation on intellectual property rights and copyright rules. We've seen some modest movement in that direction. China wants to be a world power. There is no doubt about it. They want to be the world power. And I've gotten a lot of questions on, are they going to supplant the U.S.? Could we see the yuan replace the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency? I am not seeing any of that in the data. I am not seeing it in the data. I look at trade flows. I use SWIFT. It's international trade settlement, particularly on things like commodities, and the U.S. dollar remains incredibly, it is by far the dominant currency that is used for pricing, because when companies and countries internationally are looking at how they want to price out contracts, they want some predictability, they want some stability. And the rule of law, the private property rights, the checks and balances that we have here in the United States, those checks and balances may make for clashes and sparks, and we hear about them on the news as there's fights in Washington, but the U.S. remains one of the most stable, most predictable environments in the world. China's going to continue to grow. They're putting in extensive efforts on the technology side, and I do think 5G and semiconductors are going to be a big kind of battleground for leaders in world technology over the next few years. U.S. is already starting to see some significant investments. We have Intel saying they're investing, I think it's 20 to 25 billion on building a foundry here. The U.S. is working on trade negotiations and strengthening our trade relationships with a number of the other countries. The China discussion is not going to go away, but if I have to make an estimate on what wins out over time, is it central planning? We saw this with Japan, right? Go back to the mid-90s, and Northwestern, where I went to and got my MBA, Northwestern was using Japanese management books as part of its curriculum. And at this point in time, everybody said Japan's going to take over the world, and the land underneath the Japanese national palace was apparently worth as much as the state of New York. And there was all these astronomical numbers, and there was these projections that the Japanese growth was going to continue, and they were going to eat the world's lunch. But when you had a centrally planned system, they picked manufacturing, and it worked really well until it didn't. And when you have central planning and you're directing from the top down, it's very hard to pivot. That's one of the key benefits of a free market system, of a competition-based market system where you have to adapt, you have to keep moving, because someone is always trying to eat your lunch. And so we pivot faster. It doesn't mean that we constantly win, that we always win, but I think it wins out over time. I don't think that China is going to replace the U.S. as the world power. I don't think that some of the negotiations and the clashing from the trade side, I don't think they're going to go away, but I think they're going to become more predictable. And that predictability eases the front from business investment. They don't like volatility. They don't like unpredictability. If they know that these restrictions are going to stay in place and they know that these tariff rates are going to stay in place, they can plan for that. We're seeing the business investment numbers. China, we will watch. Yes, they have a lot of people, but I don't think that they are a significant threat right now to U.S. market or economic growth.
All right, well, thank you for that. We have another question that coming in regards to maybe pivoting a little bit out of fixed income given the current interest rate environment and going more into dividend-oriented stocks.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on that strategy given where rates are right now?
Yeah, I'm seeing that a fair amount. And I will say, so let me preface this too by saying I'm primarily focused on U.S. economic. I do high-level market, and there are certainly things I'm always watching where things are moving from an interest rate standpoint. I do a lot of the writing and the research on our Fed commentary and interest rate management. But what I'm seeing when I'm watching asset flows, and I'm watching high-level asset flows, we're seeing some movements towards equities. People are saying, look, the interest rates are so incredibly low, and we all know that when interest rates go up, the prices of bonds decline. If you're holding assets and now you can get a new fixed income asset that's producing a higher yield, if you need to sell intermediate before that asset comes due, you're going to lose money on the price of it. So we're seeing people looking for alternative areas. Some of that is preferreds, but we have seen movements towards dividends. We see the cash flow improving. And so companies where there was concerns last year of dividend cuts, those dividend cut concerns look to largely be behind us. They're not completely behind us, and there are still some sectors where there remain question marks. But I think we're seeing some strong balance sheet growth this year. We've historically, coming out of recessions, we've seen some of these transitions in terms of factors and styles that work well, and dividends have tended to perform a bit better when we're starting in this kind of cyclical transition. So what's interesting to me is when we think about dividends and where they're coming from, some of the areas of the economy that see fast, like technology, is an area that has relatively decent dividend payout factors. So what we're looking at right now is companies that see strong balance sheets, companies that are paying out dividends and have the potential to raise dividends over the next few years. But companies within that, we're also looking for some of the sector exposures. We really like industrials, we like financials, we like technology. So we're looking at how do we kind of tie in, how do we implement sectors and industries that are positioned for stronger growth, some of the cyclical sectors, but also take in some of those components. I'm sure that Zach or Trevor can kind of talk about specifically where that is. I don't know
Sure.
our product side of things or can't reference any kind of funds either from First Trust or otherwise. But it's certainly an area that we're seeing trend movement towards, looking towards dividends, looking for these companies that are going to have the ability to pay out and bring in income where the traditional fixed income asset classes are not able to fill that role right now.
All right, well, fantastic. We have a couple other questions that have come in. I'm not sure if we have time to answer any of them. I know maybe a quick one for you guys to answer is, how do our members get your weekly outlook?
Yeah, so it's on the First Trust website. I don't know if I can pull it up on here. If you go to ftportfolios.com, First Trust, Frank, Tom, ftportfolios.com, on the left-hand side of the screen, you're going to see two photos. One is Bob Carey, our chief market strategist. One is Brian Westbury, our chief economist. And right above their pictures is a link. And that link has the sign up for our economic commentary, our market commentary. We have specific asset classes that we put out commentary on. Or if you reach out to Zach or Trevor or myself, we can connect you to that as well. Again, everything on there is completely free. And everything from our team, from the econ team, is retail approved. There's some under our market side that's institutional use only, but they also have some retail commentary. And if you'd like to receive it in any of those formats, reach out to this. My email, and let me go ahead and just put that up on the screen real quick. My email address is Opdyke, AOPDYKE @ftadvisors.com. So, and I'll send that over. I'll send that over to Michelle and Ashley afterwards if they want to send that out in any follow-up. If you want to reach out to me, I can get you added to that list. If you reach out to Trevor or Zach, we can get you added as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And I know Michelle also included a link where you can sign up for your newsletter right directly on your website as well. So if you guys want to check that out, and I'm sure we could keep talking on about interest rates, unemployment, inflation for quite some time today, but we appreciate your insight and everything you've captured over the past hour.
Thank you so much for having me back.
Thank you. All right, bye.
Take care, everyone. Thanks.